Earlier we were thinking about instrumental action and how paying attention to the role of motor representations of goals could help us to better understand philosophical questions about action, and how maybe philosophers have somewhat neglected those questions and so missed out some important aspects of action understanding. Maybe even needing a fundamentally different approach to philosophy of action once those are recognised. Who knows? Or perhaps not. A variety of opinions were expressed about that in this class. Now, what we've just seen, we've got motor representations from way back when in the picture. We've also just seen that there's a kind of joint analogue of the notion of a goal for joint action, namely that of a collective goal. We've just seen that. So let's put those things together and see if we can do something analogous with motor representations for the case of joint action. So let's see how that goes. Now, what you know, if you've even just glanced at the literature, is that when you approach joint action, you're just faced with this wall of shared intention. Not everybody, but nearly everybody, not everybody, but nearly everybody is pursuing joint action by assuming that joint action involves shared intention and then thinking, well, what is that shared intention? That's the absolutely standard approach. Now, one reason that we might be motivated to change our approach, not necessarily, well, not forced to, but might be interesting for us to consider, is that there are, in our lives, yours and mine, a great number of what I'll call very small scale joint actions. So the small scale joint actions are familiar because this is what Michael Bratman and Margaret Gilbert and others focus on. So things like playing a piano duet, toasting our success together, or washing up together. These would count as small scale joint actions. But they involve, of course, things which are much smaller in scale. That's to say, things that are further along the chain if we organise actions by means ends. If we think about the goals of actions as having a means end ordering, that would be a partial ordering. So we can think of the very small scale ones as further down that ordering. There's a careful definition on your handout if you're interested. So in playing a piano duet together, you and I would of course be playing a particular chord together. That in itself would be a joint action and a very small scale joint action relative to this one being small scale. Likewise for clinking some glasses or passing a plate or another object between us in the course of washing up. So my thought here is that it's kind of crazy to think that we can explain something about this scale of joint action, the very small scale, by appeal to something like shared intention, because I think if there is such a thing as intention at all, it must be linked to practical reasoning and therefore would be a relatively slow process. It will not be able to operate at this timescale. Now, I don't think that there's going to be a decisive argument here because there are too many different views about the nature of about the nature of intention and about shared intention and practical reasoning. And I think that there are not enough constraints for us to make any kind of decisive argument here. So all I'm offering you is a piece of kind of informal motivation. If you're impressed by the thought that these are joint actions just as much as these are, then you might be motivated to consider alternatives to shared intention, or you might not. Or you might not. I don't think that we're going to get a good argument here because I don't think there's enough constraints on what intention can do. But I think that we ought to consider carefully whether intention can operate on the very rapid timescales, fractions of a second, that are involved in coordinating successfully when we clink glasses or pass a plate between each other. All right, so there's the motivation, but let's start at the beginning. You know from a previous section that a collective goal is an outcome to which our actions are directed, where this is not only a matter of my actions being directed to this outcome and of your actions being directed to it. If we're going to do any kind of philosophical theory of joint action, we therefore need to answer a very basic question. So I take it that this is the price of admission. If your theory of joint action doesn't answer this question, it's not a theory of joint action yet. Keep working on it. If it does answer this question, there may be many further questions that you also need it to answer, but this is a sign that you've got started. You've made a good start. And the question is, in virtue of what could our actions, yours and mine, have a collective goal? So if I go back to my favourite way of illustrating this, there are a bunch of things that we are doing, you and I. So one of us is lighting a cigarette and so on in the background. But among the various things that are going on concurrently in our lives, there's this sort of group of things that hangs together. And then there are these various actual and possible outcomes. And it turns out that one of these, blocking the way for some people behind us, not amusing them or scaring them, but blocking the way for them, is a goal to which our actions are directed. So if you're asked about this afterwards, you might say, look, gosh, it really wasn't our goal to scare them, much less to freak them out. The goal of our actions, Steve's and mine's, was simply to block their progress. That's what you might say about this case afterwards. And in saying that, you're of course saying that this was the blocking was the collective goal of our actions as opposed to it being the scaring. The idea is that all of these actions taken together, yours and mine, are collectively directed to that outcome, where this isn't a matter just of the actions individually being directed to that outcome. So then the question is, well look, in virtue of what could that be true? You've said the goal of our actions, Steve's and mine's, was not to scare them, much less to freak them out, but to block their progress. What could make that true? In virtue of what could it be the case that our actions have blocking them as their collective goal? Now I take it that we can answer this question by appeal to shared intention, whatever that is. So I don't know what shared intention is, but if there is such a thing as shared intention, then shared intention minimally is going to specify or perhaps even represent one or more of these outcomes. It's going to provide for the coordination of our actions, and it's going to provide for the coordination of our actions around that outcome. And so that will thereby meet the sufficient condition that we gave earlier for our actions to have a collective goal. If they're coordinated around the outcome by shared intention or by any other thing, doesn't matter what it is, then sure, they will have that collective goal. What I want to argue is that there are also cases where it's an interagential structure of motor representation that provides for this specification of an outcome, coordination of the actions, and in such a way as to increase the probability that the outcome specified occurs. And therefore the interagential structure of motor representations alone is sufficient to ground the directedness of our actions to the collective goal. That's my thesis. So I want to say there are cases in which it is our motor representations in virtue of which our actions have a collective goal. Now I haven't told you what the interagential structure of motor representation is. Hold tight, that will come towards the end. We're going to approach this quite indirectly. We're going to try and sort of build up to that conclusion. So how do we get there? How do we get towards that conclusion? Well, the first thing I want to do is just to follow a clue. And this clue stops very far short of establishing the conjecture that I'm proposing. Collective goals are represented motorically and indeed ground the directedness of our action to collective goals. So here's the clue. We know that motor representations concerning another's action occur in joint action. Let me illustrate this point by mentioning some of the evidence. Sorry, before I do, I wanted to tell you, at this point, if I was giving a live lecture, I'd normally give you a bit of a recap on motor representation. But I'm not going to do that here because the lecture notes have this lovely search function. I'm very proud of this search function. I didn't write the code for this, I'm just using someone else's. And you only have to type 4 characters, MOTO, and it will take you directly to the section on motor representation. So, of course, you need a recap on what motor representations are. Of course, you've forgotten. That was weeks ago. But you don't need me to give you that, do you? All right, very good. So here's the clue. We know that motor representations concerning another's action do occur in joint action. But how do we know that? Well, here's a brilliant experiment by the absolutely fabulous neuroscientist Dimitri Cortis and his colleagues. At the time he was working with Natalie Sebans and Gunther Knoblich in their lab. And in the first experiment that I want to show you from back in, I think this was 2012 or so, very simple. You've got 3 people here, one of whom is merely observing, for reasons that I won't go into, and then this central object here. And what can happen is that the participant can be in a condition where the participant has himself, in this case it's a him, has to lift it up and then lower it. Or, so that's the self case, the participant can be the giver, so the participant has to lift up this central object and pass it to the confederate here. Or, the participant can be in a condition where the confederate lifts up the object and passes it to the subject. It's very simple. Now, what Cortis and colleagues thought was, I wonder what's happening in the motor system of the participant at the point where the participant is waiting to receive the object from the confederate. And this is something that they could study because they had a very strict timing schedule for this experiment, and also because there's a difference in how long it is before you act when you're the giver versus when you're the receiver. So there's a go signal that tells you when the action should start. If you're the giver, then you need to start moving pretty quickly after that, indeed as pretty much as quickly as you can after you've seen the go signal. So you start performing the action. If you're the receiver, on the other hand, well, you need to wait a little bit before you start. And this is the data from the participants. So you can see that just as you would expect, the receivers are not starting to move until quite some time after the givers have started. Why is this relevant to us? Well, during this period when the receiver is not actually moving yet, we can think, what's going on in the receiver motorically? What Cortes and colleagues found using an electroencephalography component called the contingent negative variation, CNV, which is a marker of motor preparation. What they found is that not in the self condition, but in both the give and receive condition, you have a kind of peak around the time of the movement onset of the giver. So that was interesting because when the receiver is acting, if the receiver's action preparation concerned only the receiver's own action motorically, we would not expect to see this peak in the CNV signal here, time locked to the giver's actions. We would expect to see that a little bit later on, time locked to the receiver's own actions, which start later. So why is it that the receiver is doing some kind of motor preparation at the time the giver is doing that motor preparation? What's going on there? Well, Cortes and colleagues hypothesize that what the receiver is doing is in effect planning the giver's actions in order to anticipate the timing and improve coordination with them. So that by actually planning as if the receiver were the giver, they're able better to anticipate the timing and therefore have a smoother handoff. And they were able to provide some evidence for this because they looked at the correlation in individual participants between the timing of the CNV in the receiver and the degree to which that handoff was coordinated. Was it better coordinated or worse coordinated? And they found that those two things are correlated. And that's just what we would predict if the CNV signal was the receiver planning the giver's actions, covertly, motorically planning the giver's actions in order to anticipate their timing. That ought to improve the smoothness of the coordination, and indeed it seems that it did. So there's a lovely, relatively old piece of work. And these researchers, a similar group of researchers led by Cortes, followed up by doing an experiment which involved clinking glasses. So here they've got a completely different experimental logic. They're contrasting three conditions, one in which two people, participant and confederate, clink their glasses, one in which the confederate alone clinks two glasses together with her two hands. So this is one person acting alone but using two hands instead of one. And then also a condition where the experimental participant lifts up one glass as if to clink it, but is just lifting up one glass. And they reasoned like this. If what's happening in the individual motorically concerns only her own actions, then the joint action condition should look very much like the individual unimanual condition. On the other hand, if what's happening in the joint action condition is that the participant is representing motorically not only her own actions, but also that of the other person, the action partner's actions, then the joint case should look more like the bimanual case, because in both cases there are two glasses in motion. And once again they looked at that EEG component called the contingent negative variation, which is this index of motor planning in these particular circumstances. There's an entry on the CNV and the glossary if you're interested, with a reference for lots of information about it. And what you can see here, we're really just interested in the critical time window just before the go signal. What you can see here is that the unimanual condition looks quite different from the others. It's the joint and the bimanual condition that go together. And what that suggests is that the participant motorically is planning not only her own actions, but also those of the confederate, much as if it was her that was moving both of the glasses, rather than she just moving one and the confederate moving the other. So overall, this is quite good neuropsychological evidence that motor processes occur in joint action which appear to concern not your actions, but your partner's actions. Now, importantly, you might be thinking, look, Steve, how much should we trust these neuroscientific signals? There's always a degree of uncertainty about exactly what an EEG component signals. What is that really a signal of? And there's always a question, if we change the situation slightly, would it look different? So it's important that we can get at the same basic principle using a variety of different measures. And it's nice to switch here from an EEG measure to a behavioural measure. So this is the same broad group of researchers, but led by Vera Ramazzoni, who's how to describe Vera? So she's a behavioural psychologist, very interesting. She comes from a dynamic systems theory background, but then she's also worked with a group of psychologists and neuroscientists who are very committed to thinking about the way that joint actions are represented. So there's a lovely merging of two different research cultures in her work. So Ramazzoni. So what Ramazzoni and colleagues did was beautiful. They examined the effect of you and I performing an action where we are led by another couple. So you and I are acting jointly, and the model that we're responding to is also a couple of people acting jointly. They compared this with a case where you and I are acting jointly, but we're responding to a single model. Now, what happens from the individual point of view is exactly the same in both cases. So I have to perform a particular kind of movement, say, in response to what the model does. And that's the same across both conditions. So if your action is irrelevant to me from a motor point of view, we should not see any change in the skill with which I perform the action in response to this signal. I should respond the same way in response to one person as I do to two, because after all, motorically, this other person is irrelevant. If, on the other hand, as Cortis et al. Already gave us some evidence to think, when I'm acting in this situation with you, I'm representing not just my actions, but your actions, then I ought to respond better in this case, because what I'm observing is closer to what I'm doing, so will provide greater facilitation than in this case where there's just one person, and therefore there's a kind of difference in the stimulus and the action as I'm representing it. And of course, it's important that Ramazzoni and colleagues also look at the opposite case. So you're acting now alone individually, and you're either imitating a joint or an individual participant. And the wonderful finding from this piece of research, which is there's other bits and pieces that support this as well, so it's not a single finding, you use different paradigms, is that individuals are better at imitating individuals than dyads, and dyads are better at imitating dyads than individuals. There's that lovely cross. What this tells us then is that when you're acting jointly with others, the way that you represent the action includes some aspects of the other's actions as well, even though you're not performing them. And that's why you're better at imitating the dyad than the individual person. Brilliant, absolutely brilliant. So now we're faced with this question. We've seen that when you're performing an action jointly, there are motor representations concerning not just your own actions, but also those which are linked to your partner's actions. Now we have to ask the question, what are those motor representations doing there? Why should we find those things? Representing an action motorically is relatively costly. It will make some things faster and other things slower and so on. So there must be some, or it's reasonable to think, that there's some benefit to those motor representations occurring there. And this is what the conjecture that we're interested in would explain. The conjecture is that the collective goals are represented motorically. So here's the thought. In the Ramazzoni et al. Imitation experiment, if we think of the collective goal as the movements that you and I produce, right? You and I are required to produce these movements. If we think of that as a collective goal of our actions and represent that motorically, then that motor representation will trigger planning-like processes, not just for my actions, but also for your actions. And that would explain why those motor representations are there. Okay, very good, very good. Now, I want to stress here that this is not a conjecture that you're getting just from me. You can also find this in the literature. So Louisa Sekeli and her colleagues, we'll come to some of their work in a moment, offer this conjecture in a form of what they call dyadic motor plans. So their hypothesis is that motor interactions might be based on the ability to integrate your action and a partner's action within a unitary, dual person, they say, dyadic motor plan that incorporates, as I would say, the collective goal, So this is going a little bit beyond the conjecture that I'm offering. And if you follow Sekeli et al.'s work through to the most recent papers, you'll see that there's some development in their thinking about this dyadic motor plan. But what I want to stress here is this: regardless of the details of exactly how this is supposed to work, if Sekeli et al. Are right, then the conjecture follows. They're committed to the conjecture that collective goals are represented motorically, and a bit more. So it's not just me who's offering this conjecture. Now, this conjecture raises two questions. The first is, if the conjecture's true, how's that going to answer our questions about, in virtue of what it is, that two or more agents' actions could have a collective goal? How are we going to answer that question? The second question is, how do we know whether the conjecture is true or false? Now, ordinarily, I'd be asking this question first. But in order to understand this question, we need to derive some predictions from the conjecture. And it turns out that to understand why the predictions follow, we need to understand something about the answer to the first question. So I actually want to start with the first question here. I will give you some evidence that the conjecture is true. I'm not leading you up a blind alley here, or go sort of throw you off at the end. But first of all, I want to understand something theoretical. We've got this question, in virtue of what are my actions and your actions directed to a collective goal. We want to say it's a consequence of the motor representation of the collective goal. There's an outcome that I represent motorically and that you represent motorically, and that somehow makes it the case that that outcome is a collective goal of our actions. That's where we want to get to. The problem is, well, how does that follow? Does that make sense? Right? And so put it like this: collective goal is just an outcome. It's just a possible or actual state of the world. So let's say the collective goal in this case is the clinking of the glasses. We're there celebrating something and we raise a toast and we clink glasses successfully. So no wine is spilled, we haven't smashed any glass and so on. We've made eye contact. Very complicated, coordinated movement where the timing is incredible, right? The fact that humans can do this is a really extraordinary thing to do. Try getting a robot to clink glasses with you at a wedding. Incredible refinement of motor control. But here's the thing, right? So representing that outcome, the clinking of the glasses, well, all that gets us is that I've represented the outcome and you've represented the outcome. What we need to understand is how that representation could make it the case that the clinking of the glasses is a collective goal of our actions. So let me step right back here and consider a case of individual action. So I'm going to suppose that you're moving an object, so a little bit like in the first Cortis et al. Paradigm that we were thinking about. So you're picking up an object, moving it and putting it down again. Now this is a complicated action which has many parts. You have to get the object, move it and position it, and each of those parts of course has subparts. What interests me about this action though is that you would typically perform it with two hands, and I'm imagining a case where you do. So there's a transfer from one hand to the other hand during this action. Now what that tells us is that the actions of your two hands have to satisfy certain relational constraints. So there's a variety of places when you pick up the object. Sorry, I forgot, I need an object. So here's an object. So when I pick up the object, I then take it with the other hand and release it with the first hand. Now what that tells us is that the two hands have to meet somewhere in space and time. There's a variety of places that they can meet in space and time, so they can meet here or they can meet here, but they must meet. Failure of them to meet will result in the mug dropping, right? Okay. Now you might think, well look, that's a very simple coordination problem. But if you look at how humans actually do it, when things are going well, what's really interesting is that the first hand is already releasing the mug before the second hand has is known to grasp it. So the sensory feedback from the second hand to confirm the secure grasp hasn't yet reached you, and you've already started releasing it here. And that enables you to pass the object from one hand to another with incredible tight coordination, beautifully timed coordination. How is that possible? Well, the answer is, given that you're not getting the sensory information from the second hand in time, you're acting ahead of the sensory information. The only way that could be possible is if the plan for the movements of the left hand and the plan for the movements of the right hand are not completely distinct. The way that you achieve this bimanual coordination is by having, in effect, a single plan that integrates the movement of the left hand and the movement of the right hand. Otherwise, you would be relying on sensory information about what the second hand is doing before the first hand can be sure it's time to release it. All right, very simple idea. So bimanual coordination involves a plan that covers the operations of two hands. Right? Steve, why are you making such a big deal out of this? Well, think about what happens in the joint case. First of all, we can have cases where there's the same goal. So instead of me moving the object and passing it to my other hand, I can pass it into your hand and you can place it. So we can take the individual action, the bimanual one, and turn it into a joint action. You've seen several cases of that already. So the goal can be the same. We also have a similar timing problem. I need, of course, to start releasing the object as rapidly as possible. So if I'm waiting for a lot of sensory feedback to check that you've really got it, our interaction will not go smoothly. And over time, that will become very boring. Humans are able to pass objects to each other and release them with incredibly tight temporal and spatial coordination. What the conjecture about motor representation suggests is that it's not just that we've got the same goal and the same coordination problem, matching timing and space. It's that the solution to that coordination problem involves much the same kind of planning as well. So when we're passing an object, the outcomes that I represent motorically include not just my part of getting and moving the mug, but also your part as well, because I represent the collective goal of moving the mug from one place to another, even though that collective goal involves actions that you and not I will eventually perform. So it's as if I am representing much of your actions motorically and you're representing much of mine. Why is that helpful? Well, here's the thought. If I'm representing let me go backwards actually. What we really want here is for the way that I plan my part of the action to constrain and be constrained by the way that you plan your part of the action. So if I now make a plan for your part of the action, and if my plan for your part of the action is close enough to your plan for your part of the action, and also my plan for your part of the action constrains my plan for my part of the action, then it will be as if my plan for my part of the action will be constrained by your plan for your part of the action. That's not exactly what's happening, but it's as if that's happening because my plan for my part of the action is constrained by my plan for your part of the action, but that my plan for your part of the action is or is close enough to your plan for your part of the action. So indirectly, it's your plan that's constraining my plan, and conversely. This is why representing collective goals motorically could be facilitating coordination of such a kind as to make it more likely that we achieve those collective goals by providing for the useful coordination of our action. So there are going to be, of course, differences between the joint case and the individual two-handed case, bimanual case. The first difference is that in the individual case, there's just one agent with just one plan, whereas in the joint case, there are two agents and each agent has a plan for the whole action. So we need to be sure that those plans match. They're similar enough that the differences won't matter. Otherwise, things will go horribly haywire. So one thing we would expect here is that the motor representation of a collective goal will be important and useful in cases where we have comparable motor expertise, and not useful and even potentially disastrous in cases where we have very different kinds of motor expertise, because in that case our plans will fail to match. The second thing is that When you're representing the overall outcome to which our actions are directed, that motor representation is triggering some planning-like processes concerning actions that I will eventually perform. So there'd better be something that prevents you from performing those actions. And that's of course not needed in the individual case. This is also a difference between the joint and the individual case. So here's what I'm suggesting. The conjecture is that collective goals are represented motorically. We should understand that as saying, when there are our actions, yours and mine, which need to be coordinated, we're passing the mug, me to you and you placing it, then there'll be a single outcome, the movement of the mug from one place to another, that we each represent motorically. In each of us, that representation will trigger planning-like processes. Those planning-like processes will concern all of our actions, not just the actions that I will eventually perform, but also in you, the actions that you will eventually perform. And that will result in facilitating the coordination of our actions around the outcome represented. So that's the conjecture. So that's why I think it's the case that where you and I represent an outcome motorically, and those motor representations provide for the coordination of our action in such a way as to make it more likely that the outcome that we are representing motorically occurs, less likely that we drop the mug, break it, or something horrible goes wrong, you miss it altogether. More likely that the outcome occurs, those motor representations ground the directedness of our actions to that outcome. That's to say, it's in virtue of the motor representations that our actions have the collective goal. That's brilliant. Okay, we understand this. So the conjecture theoretically makes some kind of sense. The conjecture theoretically makes some kind of sense. The problem, of course, is to know whether or not the conjecture is true. But here we're fortunate that just recently there's a variety of researchers that have gone about and explicitly tried to test this conjecture. So what you need to do is, of course, to generate some predictions from the conjecture. I'll consider just two predictions, but there are a couple more that we might have considered. So the first prediction is that if we imagine a case where you, as the participant in an experiment, are asked to draw either a circle or a line, and you're observing somebody else who's drawing a circle or a line, we can frame this in two ways. We can either say, you and the other person are drawing in order to create a single design. Or we can say, you're doing your drawing, and over here, here's our confederate, he's doing his drawing, and I'd like you to watch what he's doing as you're doing your drawing. Please pay attention to that. So we can frame the agent's simultaneous unimanual actions as either joint actions or parallel actions. Now, one thing that we know that's been nicely studied is that if I'm asked to draw a line, a straight line going up and down, while I, with my other hand, draw a circle, what we'll find is that the line becomes less straight compared to a condition where I'm drawing two lines. So this is a consequence of bimanual coupling. There's a kind of ovalization of the straight line. When this hand's drawing a circle and this hand's moving up and down, the up and down movements will become more oval than if I'm doing straight lines with both hands. The idea is this: if we get people to frame this in a joint way, that will increase the probability that collective goals are represented motorically if the conjecture is true. But if they're representing the collective goal motorically, your drawing and my drawing, then we should get the effects of bimanual coupling, even though this person is moving just with one hand, so that there should be significantly greater ovalization in their line. By contrast, reasoned Dyadic and colleagues, when we frame it in the parallel case, it's less likely that that collective goal will be represented motorically. So although the participant should still be attending to the other drawing, the way that the action's represented won't cause greater ovalization. So here's the setup that they have. So here's the participant in the experiment, and the case that we're interested in, the participants drawing this sort of straight line on a drawing pad, producing the output on the screen here. Here's the confederate. This was often Gabriele himself, and Gabriele is drawing on his pad, and that output is being displayed here for the participant to look at. And so this experiment was done with reasonable care. So for example, they're checking that whether or not you frame it as joint or parallel action, the attention is being paid to the other person's drawing comparably in both cases, that synchronization with the two actions and so on is similar. And what they found is exactly what was predicted by the conjecture that collective goals are represented motorically. When you frame it as a joint action, participants are acting almost as if there was bimanual coupling. Their straight lines are becoming oval. Whereas when you frame it as two separate actions, please pay attention to what Gabriele is doing, but it doesn't concern you otherwise, you don't see the ovalization to anything like the same degree. You don't see those two same effects, exactly what was predicted. Brilliant. So that's one way to support this conjecture. A second way to support this conjecture comes from the work of Luisa Sekeli and her colleagues working in Eraldo Palacios' lab. So Sekeli is this rather brilliant psychologist, cognitive psychologist, neuroscientist. And we already saw her because she postulated those dyadic motor plans. So she's certainly someone who has a view that entails that this conjecture is true. So they tested this prediction of the conjecture. If we frame a pair of sequential actions as a joint action, then that should alter what makes things incongruent versus congruent, versus if we frame the two agents' actions when they're acting sequentially as independent of each other. So this is easier to see. The prediction's easier to see if I show you the stimuli. So Sekeli and colleagues have this rather lovely musical box, and you can do two things with the musical box. So you can tap it, and when you tap it, it'll make one tone, or you can squeeze it, and when you squeeze it, it'll produce another tone. And in all of their conditions, the participant would squeeze or tap, the confederate would squeeze or tap, the participant would squeeze or tap, and the confederate would squeeze or tap. So there's always a sequence, a predefined sequence. But what was happening was framed in one of two ways. So one condition, Sekeli and colleagues framed it as a joint action. So you and the confederate are producing this kind of nice little piece of music together. The other case, the instructions said, look, you're going to produce these notes and the confederate is going to produce those notes, and that's the end of it, two separate sets of notes. But what you notice in this experiment, like in the previous one, the difference is only in the way it's framed, what's said before the experiment. After that, everything else should be the same in the way that things are presented. Now here's what's really brilliant. I absolutely love this. It's one of my absolute favourite experimental ideas. What they did was very simple. They looked at two kinds of potentially incongruent action. So one was, if what I observe is the confederate performs an action like tapping and I have to squeeze. So that's incongruent in the sense that the very proximal goal, the tapping, is different from the squeezing. And you might think, look, if I see a tap and I have to tap myself, then I'm probably going to be faster than if I tap when I squeeze. And if you tap and then I squeeze. So I see a tap and tap, it's kind of easier, it's like an imitation task. But if I see a tap and I have to perform the other thing, the squeeze, I'm going to be a bit slower there. And some reason to think that might be true. So that was one type of incongruence. The other type of incongruence they studied involved reversing the contingency between the action and the tone for the confederate, not for the participant, just for the confederate. So what would happen is that at some point in the experiment, as the trial was working its way through, when the confederate tapped, it would produce the note that was previously produced by the confederate from squeezing, and conversely. So for the confederate, you've got the opposite notes coming out. And they asked the question, Sekeli and colleagues, how badly would that reversal of contingencies throw people off? And here's the idea. If collective goals are represented motorically, then framing the action as a joint action ought to increase the probability that the goal of producing the whole sequence of notes will be represented motorically. And in that case, we should find that the reversal in which notes the confederate's action produces generates a fairly large piece of interference, whereas whether you have to do something complementary or the same as the confederate should produce very little interference because many joint actions are complementary. Conversely, when this experiment is framed as an individual case, so I'm performing some notes and the confederate's performing some notes too, and you're going to alternate, you're going to take it in turns, right? But it's just you doing your notes and she's doing her notes. In this case, we should find a larger effect for the incongruent actions, the proximal goals. So tapping should be relatively fast, tap, grab should be relatively slow. But changing the confederate's note should make little or no difference, because that's just the confederate's actions. That's all they're doing. So here are the results. Here's what they found. So here you can see that in the individual condition, there was a small but significant effect of the proximal congruence. So tapping in response to seeing a squeeze or squeezing in response to seeing a tap was a bit slower than tapping in response to a tap, whereas there was no effect at all for joint action. In fact, if anything, there's a trend in the opposite direction, but that's not statistically reliable. So that's very nice. But here's the even better thing. When you change for the confederate what the squeeze produces and what the tap produces, that has a very big effect when this is framed as a joint action, but almost no effect on the participants in the individual case. What are we measuring here? We're measuring the IES. So this is a measure that combines error rates and response times in order to look at how accurately people are performing this task. So kind of, as it were, how well coordinated they are, taking into account the fact that there's a trade-off between going faster to make more errors or slowing down. Very good. And also they did some Bayesian statistics, because why not? Everybody is these days. So this is fantastic. We've seen that there are two predictions from the conjecture that collective goals are represented motorically. Both predictions have been tested, and the observations made in testing those predictions so far have supported both of the predictions. And that gives us some confidence that this conjecture is likely to be true. We need to be a little bit tentative here until we see a much larger range of evidence for it. But it's promising. It's a very promising start that we have tested these two conjectures. So we know the conjecture is true, not because it's some kind of piece of philosophy and we have to do some bit of reasoning, but rather because the conjecture generates readily testable predictions, and so far those predictions have been confirmed. Well done us. But look, why were we interested in all of this in the first place? Well, the thought was this: any theory of joint action needs to explain, in virtue of what it is, that two or more agents' actions could have collective goals. Answering that question is not necessarily the only thing that your theory of joint action should do, but it's the price to entry. It's the price to entry. If you can't answer that question, you don't yet have a theory of joint action at all. And what we've seen is that there are cases in which the answer to the question, in virtue of what are our actions directed to a collective goal, is motor representation. It's because there is this interagential structure of motor representations of an outcome in you, of the same outcome in me, which in you trigger planning-like processes, and in me trigger planning-like processes, where the plans in me and the plans in you match. They're similar enough that the differences won't matter for our coordination. It's in virtue of that that our actions have the collective goal of producing a particular kind of drawing, or of clinking glasses, or of playing a chord on the piano, and so on. This is why that is. So as promised, we can see that it's not just shared intention, but also interagential structures of motor representations, in virtue of which our actions can have collective goals. And that tells us that if we're going to do good theorizing about the nature of joint action, it won't be enough just to consider the domain of intention, knowledge, and practical reasoning. We're also going to get our hands dirty and need to look at some of the scientific discoveries about the way that joint action unfold between two people.